Hello, and welcome to the Joss Brown Podcast. With over 40 years of combined financial planning experience, we will discuss our favorite topics, concepts, and stories.
Welcome to Joss Brown Podcast. Today, we'll be talking with Trey Parker, an expert in the field of estate planning. Trey Parker is a managing principal of the Williamsburg office of Carrell, Blanton, Ferris, and Associate. Trey loves his work, and he has assisted clients with their estate planning needs for over 10 years. Trey has extensive experience in preparing basic and complex estate planning documents. Trey's primary goal is to ensure that clients fully understand the issues and options so they can adequately develop an estate plan tailored to their circumstances and achieve their goals. Trey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome. So Trey, today we will start with, why did you become an estate planning attorney?
That's a good question. So probably like a lot of people, you have something in your past that impacted you and made you want to do what you currently do. So I was really close with my grandparents growing up, and they were very put together people, always saved their money, did the right thing, but they didn't know what they didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a very basic estate plan. They didn't put a whole lot of thought into it because they thought their circumstances were really simple. They were married 54 years. They had one daughter who was really responsible. What could go wrong? But because they didn't really put a lot of thought, and they just got a simple will, power of attorney, but as long as they had a document that had those names on it, they were like, we're good. Unfortunately, when they passed, my mom had to pay a ton in tax that she otherwise wouldn't have had to pay if the planning would have been more tailored to them. And also, they had to pay a lot in executor fees because they not that this was definitely wrong, but they used a law firm to be the executor, probably because the law firm offered that as an option, and they didn't realize, why couldn't we just have our daughter as executor? Because my mom would have been a very good choice, and it would have been a free choice. But by putting this other option, it injected an additional cost, which there's a time for that. There's a time for everything. There's no right or wrong in any particular type of estate plan, but are the choices and options you're making the right ones for you, or are you injecting an unnecessary cost or some other inefficiency? So because of that, because I was so close to them and I saw these things that happened that didn't have to happen, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and my same grandmother actually said, wouldn't it be cool if you were a lawyer? So I just dovetailed being a lawyer while also doing this. So that's a long-winded answer. I'll try not to be that way for everything, but that's what made me do it. There was something bad that happened in my life and made me decide
Is it cool?
Being an estate planning attorney?
It's
not as glamorous as it appears on TV.
When you're 20?
Trey, you really need to stop, because we know that you have your estate planning done and everything is planned out to the end.
My estate plan is probably better than most people my age, I would say, because
That
at
is
least
correct.
I have one. But I probably do suffer a little bit of the cobbler's kids have no shoes issue, where there might be one or two accounts where I'm like, what's the beneficiary on that? I don't know. I'd have to double check. So we'll talk about that. Having beneficiary designations is really important. But, I get so caught up sometimes dealing with clients that you let your own stuff fall.
Well, you said your grandparents had a simple estate.
Well, it was simple. So that it's like, how do you define simple? Because
what would you say is a normal engagement for you or your clients?
Well, the simplest engagement would be a traditional family, meaning husband and wife are long-term marriage, let's say 50-year marriage, and they have children together that are their beneficiaries, and there's no problems with any of those. That's the perfect scenario.
Except that probably doesn't exist.
It exists very infrequently these days. And so that's the kind of scenario where there's the least likelihood of problems. However, like in the situation with my grandparents and my mom, that was their situation, but yet there was still problems. So, when you have a situation like that that's simple, the fact that accidental problems can occur, just think about how they're magnified if you have a blended family, where the children are not theirs together, or you have a kid who has some kind of drug problem or maturity problem. Then you have all the same problems that my grandparents accidentally fell into, but then you have all these other problems that can be even worse. So, more often we deal with blended families than we deal with traditional families. A lot of times people come in and if they've been married 55 years, their kids are all so-called good kids, no issues, everybody gets along. I always go, man, you guys are weird. And they're like, what do you mean? We're normal. And I'm like, yeah, but normal's the new weird. But you got to think about that. I mean, my main takeaway for a proper estate plan is, don't get a trust just because you hear on the radio you should get a trust, or get a will because your neighbor told you to get a will. You need to do some kind of investigation into all the different options, apply your circumstances to it, and then have something that's tailored, because there is no one size fits all, just like a financial plan.
Correct.
You don't invest in the same stock or have the same approach for everybody. You want to tailor it. And estate plan, I think, sometimes is viewed as too cookie cutter. It's like, oh, cool, do you have a power of attorney? Oh, you're good. Do you have a will? You're good. It's like, well, I don't know. What do they say? How do they operate? How does that dovetail into everything else?
Yeah, I've talked with people that say that, oh, I've got a simple plan, simple family, and so I'm just going to do the online estate docs. What do you think about that?
Those could be good. They can be fine. If you do something online, you could end up with a good product. It's just who's guiding you through that process. So if someone is sophisticated enough to use that computer program, select the proper options, think of all the contingencies, yeah, they could. There's a chance that they could do something just as good as an estate planning attorney could do. But the probability that some amateur person is going to start navigating some wizard on a website and come out with the right thing is probably not a high probability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's like your grandfather. You said he doesn't know what he doesn't know.
Right.
And so that's why we recommend meeting with an attorney, so that they can have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Trey, you mentioned a child that may be on drugs. And so when clients come to you and they have wayward children or special needs children, is there any concern or special planning that you put in place for people like those?
Sure. So typically someone like that, you would want to leave it to them in some kind of a trust, because you may say, hey, my son has all these issues that he's dealt with,
mm-hmm.
Substance abuse problems, whatever, but hey, he's still a really good guy and he's
Correct.
Still my son,
mm-hmm.
but I just can't give him $500,000 because he'll do something unwise with it. So you can still leave it to him, but you got to leave it to him with some kind of conditions. So that's some type of trust arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
But again, there's a lot more details that need to be fleshed out. Like, not just do you leave it to him in trust, but it's okay, what are the terms of that trust? How is it doled out? A big one is, who's in charge of that?
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people will have the knee-jerk reaction of, which isn't necessarily wrong, but they'll say, oh, well, I'm going to put my oldest daughter in charge of that son.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that may be the right choice, but have you considered the tension that that's going to cause between
mm-hmm.
them? Because
mm-hmm.
now you have a parent-child relationship between siblings.
Mm-hmm.
That may work out. We need to think about what are the dynamics,
mm-hmm.
what is the self-awareness of the son, because
mm-hmm.
he may say, well, yeah, I need this, but oftentimes it leads to resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that case, maybe you do put a law firm as trustee
mm-hmm.
or a bank as trustee.
Mm-hmm.
So for every little thing you do, you got to think about all these little nuances.
You mentioned a few times now problems with, or relationships is where problems can come, whether it's siblings or parents or what did you say, Michelle, the wayward child?
Yeah. Prodigal son.
We've found, or in my experience, we found that single people are most hesitant to go to the estate planning attorney because they don't have the relationships that you're asking for. Who are you going to give the stuff to? Who are you going to give power to help you out when you need help? What is it?
Yeah, I always get a kick out of single people and also married couples who don't have children, because if they do come into the office, one of the first things they typically say is, well, my situation should be really simple because we don't have any kids and I don't have anybody. And it's like, well, no, in a way you're right, but also in a way you're wrong, because now you got to search for who are you going to leave your stuff to or who's going to be in charge. And Virginia has a default system of if you don't plan, they plan. So if you have a brother that you're not too fond of, he could end up getting your stuff if that's the way the law of intestacy goes. So if you're a single person, you should. You have some stuff that you care about, and you hopefully care about where it ends up. Another thing, though, is not just who gets it, but who's going to be in charge of all this. I once had a case that I inherited from someone else. It wasn't anything necessarily I wanted to do, because it ended up to be a kind of a gruesome scenario. But there was an older lady who was never married, never had any children. All of her friends had died. And I was hired by the mortgage company to help them go through the probate process. And you might say, well, how'd that happen? Well, this older lady died alone in her house and was in the house alone for over a month before finally the city did a health and welfare
Discovered
check.
her.
Yeah, because of the mail was piling up in the grass. And there was nobody to come forward to deal with, well, how do we sell the house? How do we distribute her stuff? Because she didn't have a plan. She didn't make any of these appointments. So eventually creditors will come in because the creditor wants to foreclose on the house. So the creditor stepped in to be executor. And then, of course, everything gets sold at auction and everything. Probably nothing that this older lady really wanted, but that's how it can end up in an extreme scenario. So,
And I guess after then, she really didn't care either.
yeah, we don't know. There's no way for us to know that yet. But my assumption is she didn't know. Hopefully, she didn't know.
Trey, what are the five biggest mistakes in estate planning that you have seen over your time working in this field?
Okay, good question. So I hear that, like the five, and if you go on Google or Bing or any of these things, you'll see a different five, and then sometimes you'll see 6 or 10 or the 20. So I could probably go on forever about the different mistakes, but the first one that's kind of an overarching that all the others can kind of fit under is the lack of understanding or education that anyone has on how these things operate. When do you use a power of attorney? If you have a trust, do you still need a power of attorney? And when do you use the trust versus using the power of attorney? Or how's the will fit in? Most people who've spent thousands of dollars getting these things, I find that, when I get them back in for a review, or if they haven't met with me before, they haven't looked at them and they have totally forgotten which thing does what. So that's just a general. For people that have taken the step to do an estate plan, and in Williamsburg, where I'm located, it's very common for people to do a revocable living trust-based plan. The number one issue that I see is people will spend all the money to set up the plan, but they don't do their homework that's required with that plan. So a lot of people think, oh, I want to avoid probate, so I'm going to do a trust. And then they get the trust and they're like, oh, I'm good. Well, no. Did you put your house in the trust? Did you retitle your brokerage account to the trust or designate it to the trust? Because if having a trust is not going to keep you out of probate if you don't do the second necessary, just as important step and fund that trust.
And that's where we add some of our value is we help on the front end giving you information for our clients so they don't have to, or they may not have it all. And then afterwards, we help them do their homework.
Well, that's the value of having a financial advisor, is it makes the estate planning process 100 times easier on the person, because with working in Williamsburg, we have a lot of engineer clients, through NASA and everything, and engineers, they like to kind of do things on their own. So if you deal with if you don't have an advisor, and let's say you're dealing with TD Ameritrade, Schwab, all these individual companies, then the burden is on the client to contact all these different companies and get everything retitled. If, though, you have a financial advisor, you pretty much just go to your financial advisor and say, hey, I did this plan. And if they're a good financial advisor, they'll say, okay, cool, I'll start getting your stuff retitled for you, sign here. So it just makes it so much easier and more likely that someone's actually going to get it done.
Correct.
Because that's the other thing with estate planning, and one of the things that I do a little different than some of the people I work with, at least, but there's other people that do this too, is I follow up with the people on the funding. So if I do a trust for someone, I give them their homework. I'm like, okay, you need to retitle this. You need to change your beneficiary designations this way. And by the way, let's get you back in a month or two from now. So I call it the accountability appointment. So I can check their homework if they ran into problems, because if they are someone who doesn't have an advisor and they're having to do it solely on their own, they might run into a roadblock here and there. And I'm like, oh, well, you got the wrong form. You need to get this form. So
not knowing what the docs are,
Yep.
and then not funding the trust.
Not funding the trust. Also, not thinking about family dynamics as part of it. I've seen people put, in some cases you want to have, if you have 3 kids, you want to have all 3 of them be an executor or all 3 of them be a trustee. Because you don't want to pick a favorite, and for some reason family dynamics lend itself to that in some cases. In other cases, it's a terrible idea to put all 3 of your kids as executor or trustee, because what if none of them get along with each other? I mean, they're going to have to make certain discretionary decisions, like, are we going to sell the house? What are we going to sell the house? What's the price going to be? If you have 3 people all at the helm and they don't get along, that could be a nightmare.
Yeah.
So sometimes succession, first choice, second choice, third choice. Oh, that's a big one that I see is people will put all their eggs in one basket. They'll do a simple will or a power of attorney, and they have 3 or 4 kids, but they only name one as executor. And they're like, well, that's who I want as my executor. And I say, okay, what if that one's dead? Why didn't you have a backup? So I always am a big fan of having bench strength whenever you're picking your fiduciaries, whether it's your power of attorney, power of will, advanced medical directive. Have some bench strength. Number one, it's good for you so that you don't have nobody, but also it saves on legal costs in the future, because people will say, well, if that son dies, I'll just come in and update my will. And it's like, okay, well, first off, are you going to remember that, right? You don't know what condition you're going to be in when that occurs. And number 2, when you make that change, you're going to have to pay a lawyer to amend the trust or the will. So why didn't you just go ahead and put the succession on there to start off with?
And I've had the privilege of being in many meetings with you, of course.
Thank you for calling it a privilege. I don't know if that's always the case.
It is, because I've learned a lot, and also I've also seen where you've always not just focused on the here and now with the clients, but you also focus on the future, like what could happen in the future, and you want to always ensure that the clients are thinking along that line. And so with that being said, you mentioned creditor before earlier in our conversation. Should anyone be concerned about people who may have family members who they're leaving things to? Should they put anything in place for protection for creditor issue? That's number one. And is there anything that people should consider at this time? Because I know you keep up on all of the latest law. And so what is something that we should be considering about the law that may be changing in July?
Okay. All right, so a couple things there. The first one you talked about was creditor protection. So, yeah, if you have a child that is likely to have creditor issues, that's an important fact that should come up during the estate planning consultation. So let's say you had a son who was a builder, for his profession. That could be feast or famine sometimes. You can make a whole lot of money, or if a project fails, you could be hurting. Or if you had a son or daughter who was a vascular surgeon or something, you have possible malpractice lawsuits to worry about. you could leave it to that child in such a way, now it involves doing a trust, that could still have them as a beneficiary, but it could create a wall around the inheritance that you left them, so that if they did get sued and they lost everything that they had on their own, at least they would always have what you left them to fall back on. So it's a little bit more artful drafting, a little more complexity involved when you do something like that. So I'm not saying you do that all the time.
No.
But it is something that should come up, because that is something to think about. Not just creditors like lawsuits or bankruptcies, but a spouse can be a creditor too. So what happens if you have a son or daughter who really doesn't have any issues on their own, except for that person they married?
Correct.
Like you have a daughter-in-law or son-in-law you're not too thrilled with, and you think that's a rocky marriage. Well, the default under Virginia law is when you inherit property, it's not marital property subject to divorce, but it's very easy to commingle it, and then it could be lost in a divorce. But you can plan around that. Now, in Virginia, like I said, there's a default that the inheritance, unless commingled, is not marital property. In some states, though, it's not just... You don't have the advantage of that default, because what if it's a community property state? So what if your son or daughter live in California or Texas? Then, even if they did keep it separate, there's a possibility through the community property laws it could become marital property and subject to a divorce. So, you have to think about the circumstances of your children and how to draft around that. Where do they live? How do the laws of that state impact it? So, I guess the point is, estate planning, just like financial planning, is not just checking a box. It's supposed to be a more thorough analysis that's really tailored to the person. So that's on the creditor protection. What was the you want to know about changes in the law?
That may be happening July 1st.
So tell me which one you're referencing, because
I'm not referencing anyone in particular.
Okay.
Anything that you think we and the audience should be aware of at this time?
Yeah, well,
I guess that's a question. I had an attorney tell me once that there's about 100 laws that just change every year.
Yeah, that are always out
similar
there.
to estate planning.
Yeah, and in the last couple years, there's been some pretty major ones. If people haven't been keeping up, let's say over the last decade.
The exemptions.
So yeah, the exemptions. So the estate tax exemption right now is the highest it's ever been, except with the exception of 2010 when there was no estate tax, but that was a kind of
So
a
then that
misstep.
really wasn't high, was it?
No, it wasn't. Yeah, that's right. But it was unlimited.
Is Virginia considering one?
They were at one time, but with the current political environment in Virginia, that pretty much died. But it was definitely over the last couple of years something that Virginia was considering at the state level. So right now, if you're a Virginia resident, you only have to worry about the federal estate tax. Virginia does not have their own state estate tax. Many states do have their own state estate tax. A couple years ago, there were a couple bills to bring the estate tax back to Virginia. They never really made it out of committee, and now with the new elections and stuff, it's pretty much died. But that is something that could always come back. Just like the federal estate tax exemption right now is set at $10 million indexed for inflation, so it's over $12 million now. But a few years from now, it's going to drop automatically back to $5 million. But it doesn't have to, and that's if they don't do anything. It'll be $5 million indexed for inflation. But again, as part of some bills in Congress over the last couple of years, there was a movement to reduce the federal estate tax exemption to $3.5 million. The good news is, with a proper estate plan, you can mitigate or plan for some of these contingencies. Like you could have a plan that could operate pretty simply given the current estate tax environment, but have the options built into it so that if these things occur in the future, they could be triggered. Because what you don't want to, I have people come in sometimes that are worth, $6-7 million, and they're like, oh, we don't need to talk about estate tax because the exemptions are so high. And I say, well, yeah, if you die today, but do you plan on dying today, or do you plan on living another 10 years? Because there's a whole lot of legal changes,
Correct.
which is why, just like you should meet with your financial planner every so often for a review, you should meet with your estate planning attorney every so often. Now, just the nature of the relationship, you're not going to meet with your estate planning attorney as often as you meet with your financial person, because most financial people will meet with their clients once a year, if they even do that. But, that can be pretty common. It'd be a little unusual to meet with your estate planning attorney once a year, but we do say that every 5 to 10 years, even if nothing's going on in your life, why not go in for a review? But you should also go in whenever there's a major change in your life. You're retiring.
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. On the big picture, when you're working with a client, what is that process? Data gathering, docs, signing, homework, and periodic review?
Yeah, so my process is, typically if someone is interested in an estate planning consultation, we have a no-cost consultation, which we schedule 3 hours for that appointment. Now, it doesn't have to take 3 hours, but we earmark that in case it does. So prior to that first appointment, the first thing we do is we send them a packet kind of explaining the process and also asking them to fill out certain information. Who are your contemplated beneficiaries? What's the breakdown of your net worth? And then they bring all that to the first appointment. And then we sit down with them, go over their circumstances, find out their goals, and then start giving them options and designing the plan. Then at the end of that appointment, we say, okay, based on what you told us in this design, here's the cost to do something like this. And then they can decide whether they want to do it or not. If they don't want to do it, then they just go away. If they want to do it, then we go ahead and schedule them for the next appointment. We get all the paperwork done between the first and the second appointment. At the second appointment, we go over it with them, make sure they understand it. So we, again, earmark 2 to 3 hours for that, even though it doesn't always take that long, but we want to make sure we can answer all the questions. If they like it and they sign it, well then, okay, they've created an estate plan. But then what we do before they leave that appointment, we say, all right, you got some funding to do because we do a lot of trust. Here's your homework on what you need to start gathering together and the forms you need to fill out. But we're going to meet up again a month or two from now and check your homework and answer any questions. Let's say at the end of the third appointment, I can check off and say, yep, you funded your trust. Then they just go live their life. But we always tell them, we say, hey, if anything happens, come in here for a checkup. We also recommend that every 5 years you come in for a checkup. If we don't hear from you, then we'll reach out. We'll send them a letter within 5 years. We have a tickler in the system, to let us know. And we'll send a letter first, and if they don't respond to that, we'll call them. And then if they say, now we don't want to see you again, well, then we don't keep badgering them. But most people want to come in because our review there is free. But yeah, that's our process.
I know. One other question, and I'm back on this relationships and families and things. Do you ever facilitate multi-generational meetings?
Yeah, so that's thanks for bringing that up, because so before we send them on their ways.
It sounds like that's where a lot of the problems could be.
Yeah, but it can cut both ways there. So there are sometimes, when it's a good idea to tell it's a judgment call on the client's part, I guess.
I mean, you're just bringing up the options.
Right. So let's say someone has a complete plan. I will say, well, why don't you if you want, you can bring in your successor trustees or your children. And I'm happy to explain what you did, why you did it, how it works. And if the client wants that, then we'll meet with the children, which can be beneficial. Now, there are some times where maybe it's not beneficial because, what if you did a plan one day for very specific reasons, some of them not very happy, and then things resolve themselves and you change things a couple, you can set expectations sometimes.
Right.
So it's really something that you want to talk with the client about, see if it's a good idea. Sometimes if there's a messed up situation, it is to go ahead and get that transparency out there. Sometimes maybe not, but it's something we offer. And a lot of people really like it because it primes the pump prior to death.
I think it's just setting expectations too.
Yeah.
And I get your point. Sometimes you don't want to set expectations.
Yeah.
You want everyone to know what you did after you've died.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, having a general conversation and not a detailed conversation, so one person don't know what they're getting over the other person, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So in working with seniors and post-retirees, what are the things that you've noticed that's most overlooked in their estate planning documents?
So, beneficiary designations are a big one across the board, regardless of age. The easiest thing to do is put a primary beneficiary and contingent beneficiaries on your accounts. And a lot of people think, it's not a big deal if I don't do it. It could be a huge deal. Number one, if you don't have a beneficiary on the account, it will go to probate. But that's not the worst part of it, especially if it's an IRA. For an IRA or 401k, TSP, 403b, 457, any of these qualified retirement plans, not having a beneficiary changes how the thing is taxed. Because under the Secure Act, which is a law change that happened in the last couple of years, you get 10 years.
Are you reading my mind?
Maybe. but so you get 10 years, or the beneficiary does, to withdraw that. If you don't have a beneficiary listed, the best thing they get is 5. And obviously having to pull out a large IRA over a 5-year period versus a 10-year period can have huge tax consequences. And all you had to do was put a name on a form. So that's one, because a lot of people will put their spouse as the primary, and they didn't put a contingent. Spouse predeceases them. And they don't.
That's not the first thing on their list. Oh yeah, I need to change my beneficiary.
And then some 80-year-old lady dies, and her children only get 5 years to pull out the IRA because her husband had died 10 years before, and she still has him listed as the beneficiary. As far as so those are some issues that can be fixed quickly but exist a lot. One thing I see a lot of is there's people haven't planned sufficiently for long-term care. We see, even though long-term care insurance has been around now for a long time, still I'd say the majority of the people I meet with don't have it. Now some people want to self-pay, out of their own stuff, and that's fine, I guess, if that's part of your overall plan.
Right.
I'm not advocating one way or another, but you should have at least planned for it, because we have some people that are very asset rich as far as land, but they don't have a whole lot of cash.
Correct.
Well, that doesn't play too well if you have to go into a nursing home. It's like, well, you're going to have to sell the land
Which
to
is not
generate the
liquid.
cash. And who knows what the market conditions are at the time. So, the failure to think about long-term care needs is pretty common with older folks.
Yeah, and that's one of the topics we talk about with all our new clients is here's some options you have, and whether you need to take that option or not is a question, whether you want to or not, or whether you can afford it or not, or if you're insurable.
Right.
Those all go into why some people don't have long-term care insurance.
Yep.
I've heard this quite a bit. Some people, when you want to talk to them about estate planning, they want to say to you that, well, I don't like to talk about death, right? And so I could tell you what I say, but as the expert in the room, I'd like to hear what you would say to that person.
I guess it depends on the day and what kind of mood I'm in. But so there's many reasons why people don't plan. Procrastination is a big one, but normally it's, there's a reason you're procrastinating. And there are people that have a fear or just don't want to talk about it. I once had a client where his wife was gung-ho about estate planning, but she was dragging him in, right? He wanted nothing to do with it. And it got all the way to the point where we had the plan drafted, it was time to sign, and the guy wouldn't sign the plan. And it really upset his wife. But I remember I was in that meeting, and he never signed. I didn't pressure him. I was like, hey, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel comfortable, And he goes, I'm just afraid that if I sign this, I'm going to die. He had like a weird superstition thing about it. And the reason I use that as an example is he never signed the plan. He died 6 months later anyway. So you're going to die whether you
sign or not.
Plan or not. It's just he ended up dying with no plan. It would have been better. The result would have been the same as far as his mortality.
Virginia was his backup plan.
That's right. So there's many reasons. Some people are like, well, I'll get to it. Even people that aren't fearful or have some weird superstition about why they don't do it, it's not a fun thing to do. So you put it off. Or, there's a cost component to it. So in like today's economic times, if you're like, oh, eggs have gone up, this has gone up, I only have finite resources, some people don't want to spend the money.
Like your grandparents.
Like my grandparents.
Yeah. What do you find that, obviously, since he died and didn't do a plan, he may regret it. What do you find that people regret or not doing? Or is there anything?
Yeah, well, it's more that the children have the regrets. You know what I mean? Because the person is typically either dead or incompetent to a degree that they don't know.
Yeah,
might not be as pleasant for them, but no child that has to take an IRA over 5 years versus 10 is too happy about that, or someone that has to go through probate or hire a lawyer to battle with their sibling, none of that.
Yeah.
So it's really the children. Everything you do in estate planning is primarily for your children. It can be a benefit or it can be a detriment. There is a component. If you're mentally incompetent, then your estate plan can really benefit you more than it did the people behind you. But most people don't become incapacitated. Most people die,
right.
And then the people that truly benefit are the children, and they're also the ones that have the most regrets. Like, why didn't mom do this, or why didn't dad do this? Yeah.
Do you have you had kids pay for and kind of bring their parents in to do estate planning?
That's sort of rare, just because there are times, that can happen, and but me as an attorney would want to be careful about that, because about undue influence and things like that. If it'd have to be the perfect scenario for that to not give me the creeps a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise it opens the door that if there are 5 kids and one kid is taking the parent to the lawyer, paying the bill, the other kids will be like, well, hey, was this your plan or their plan?
Right.
So there's just that component.
Yeah.
Intangible wealth. Are you seeing a lot of people come in with intangible wealth where you have to design a plan for that?
Now, when you say intangible wealth, are you talking like cryptocurrency or like family values, that kind of intangible?
It could be both. But I'll allow Dan to elaborate more on that.
I'll do a couple things. One, the idea of values. The estate plan is, here's my property. How do you pass on values? Or do you help with that? Or do you know some attorneys that do that kind of thing? And then separately, not necessarily crypto, but social media and all the privacy issues and how you close down your parents' social media and all that risk could have.
Yeah, so, all right, so I'll deal with the value part first. So, part of your estate plan in and of itself passes on some kind of value, because there's a lot of messaging that can go on, and I always caution people in this. I'm like, that's why you normally, if you have 3 kids, unless there's a strong reason to treat one different, don't treat that one different, because you're going to send a message that, hey, you were the problem. But sometimes that's necessary.
Right.
So the plan in of itself can, or how you leave it to them, like if you had it to them in trust versus outright, and then a remainder beneficiary is charity. Well, that obviously shows you had some kind of value in charity. But as a large part, your plan, the documents are kind of legalistic and sterile and don't have a whole lot of feel-good stuff in it.
Right.
So what we encourage clients who want to pass on values is to do a letter to the children that gets put in with the documents, explaining this is why we did it, these are our overall goals. And we have sample letters where clients have written things like this over the years and given us permission to give them to other clients.
Get people thinking about it.
To get people thinking about it and to have a template. So writing a letter to the kids is how we deal with that.
Good.
So that's on the family values. And then on the intangible assets, or things like Facebook accounts and email. Number one, you should have all your passwords and everything in some location where you're...
They're on stickums on the front of the monitor, right?
Yeah, that's probably... not the best cybersecurity, but maybe have them in with your estate planning documents. Okay. And we actually give a little section of our binders where you could put that in. But if you don't have a good list of here's my username, here's my passwords for everything, you definitely want to make sure that the will, trust, power of attorney, whatever the appropriate document is for the time, gives the fiduciary the ability to deal with those kinds of institutions. So if you had a will or a power of attorney done 30 years ago, there's no way it's going to contemplate that.
Right.
So that would be a circumstance where, hey, it would have been better to have an up-to-date estate plan that takes into account these new technological advances. So the documents we do gives your executor or trustee or power of attorney authority to deal with internet providers as necessary.
Okay.
But the best practice is to go ahead and lay out your passwords in a safe way so that your fiduciaries can have it.
Yeah, because it used to be easy. Well, if that's easy, you'd just wait, and about 3 months of going to the post office or collecting the bills, you had all your bills.
Yeah.
But now, because your bills are sent to your email, you don't have that opportunity to see the paper bill and pay it. You have to hope that somehow you'll find out what that person owed.
Yeah, I always
before you distribute everything and have a problem later.
And you mentioned putting it in that wonderful red binder that you give the clients, the username and password. And I know people are fearful of leaving things around. So is that the best place for them to put it, or should they put it somewhere else and family members know where it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's always the problem with any kind of estate planning issue, which I tell clients, is there's going to be a rub somewhere. You're going to be damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you do this, here's the issue. So you put it in the red book and you put it under the bed. Okay, it's easy to get to, but maybe it's not the safest place. Okay, you put it in the safe deposit box then.
And they find it a month after you pass away.
Yeah, but then the problem is
nobody can get in the safe deposit box.
Yeah. What if your only copies are in the safe deposit box and your executor shows up and says, "Hey, I need to get in there." And they're like, okay, well, show us the stuff. You're like, well, it's in there. So it's like a catch-22 of how they get it. So I always tell the clients, these are the things that you need to think about. And then you make the decision of the best safekeeping place for this.
What the best question is then? It's like, what do you do?
Yeah, what do I do? Yeah. Well, mine's in my office. So
I'll ask you this question, Trey, because it just came to my mind. And so I remember learning this from you sitting in one of your meetings. Tell us more about just selecting someone to take care of your documents, executor. Is there they have to be, there are certain requirements for them to meet, for them to be able to put into that position?
Yeah, so I think some people are a little unrealistic, or they put too much qualities in what a trustee or executor should be. They're like, well, the guy needs to be a business whiz. He needs to know everything about the stock market, right? They're thinking like, is he sophisticated enough? To me, sophistication isn't the number one important thing. Really, is the person, do they have integrity? That's the most important, right? Can you trust this person? Are they a good person? Are they going to treat the beneficiaries and everybody fairly? That's number one. And then also, are they reasonably sophisticated but self-aware of where they're not sophisticated? Because you can be an executor and, okay, you can't do the tax return? No problem. Hire a CPA to do that. Oh, you don't know anything about investments? Well, no big deal, because they have a financial advisor, so they're going to help you with that. So, having a trustee, like that's like my mom's situation. Like my mom would admit she's not at least 20 years ago when her parents passed, she definitely wasn't financially sophisticated. Now, she's very frugal, very honest, very, responsible. But if you asked her anything about the stock market, she wouldn't know anything. That's probably why my grandparents put a lawyer as the executor. But, I think with proper talking, my grandparents probably would have opted for my mom recognizing, well, she can go to a lawyer for what she needs for that. She can go to a CPA for that. So it's self-awareness and integrity is what I think. And do they play well with others? You don't want to pick some lightning rod of your children to be the executor if that's your only choice. So there are times when you go to a third-party professional, but I don't think it's. I think you don't need to all the time. Is that responsive?
Yes, it is. And this is good conversation. And so before we wrap up this wonderful conversation, is there anything that you'd like for our listeners to consider about estate planning? Anything that you think they should know at this time that we did not think to ask?
Well, I'll tell one that I think people don't know, because I have a lot of folks come into my office and they'll say, hey, I want to do a trust, right? That's the first thing they say. And I go, okay, why do you want to do a trust? And they'll say, well, I want to avoid probate. And wills go through probate. And I say, that's absolutely right. But did you know that you don't have to do a trust to avoid probate? They're like, what do you mean? I mean, that everything I hear is wills, probate, trust, no probate. Yeah, beneficiary designations don't go through probate.
Correct.
So remember how important I said it is from a tax standpoint to name beneficiaries. But the other benefit of having beneficiaries on accounts is it's the most efficient method to get it to a beneficiary. It's probably the quickest one that occurs when someone dies, smoothest, and there's no probate. So then people might say, well, why in the world would anybody do a trust? Right? Because I thought that's the only reason you did a trust. Well, the trust has to deal with the control factor, because beneficiary designations always go outright. So if you have a minor beneficiary, a drug addict child, whatever, it could get wasted. That's where the trust does both. It avoids probate and you can control. But I think very few people realize that you can avoid probate. So there are people that come in that ask to do a trust because they're ignorant to all these other things. And then after we have the conversation, they end up just doing a power of attorney, a simple will, and relying primarily on beneficiary designations because that fit in their situation. You know, it doesn't fit in all, but it can. So I guess that's the big takeaway, is trying to educate yourself and not just do something because the guy down the street does it or you heard it on the radio.
That's one thing we check is beneficiaries, because beneficiaries die.
Yeah.
And so they need to be current.
Yeah.
Oh, this was great conversation. Thank you for coming on the Joss Brown podcast. And so, thank you.
Thank you.